Hi, everyone, and welcome to No Kill in Motion. I am here today with Aubrie Kavanaugh from No Kill Huntsville, Alan Rosenberg from New Jersey Animal Observer, and Shirley Marsh from Yes Biscuit. This is No Kill in Motion. We are talking today about mandatory spay neuter and mandatory chipping. Should there be laws on this? Now, it sounds like a great idea. A lot of ideas sound great when you come forward, but there's always unintended consequences. And with mandatory spay neuter, mandatory chipping, I know mandatory spay neuter, I know studies that we can actually bring up. Mandatory chipping, I don't, but I just feel like it's right down the same path. And I know how I feel about it, but I want to hear how everybody here feels about it today. So I'm going to start with you, Ellen. What do you think? Mandatory spay neuter, mandatory chipping, should we have laws that actually make these mandatory or not?
The answer is no. There's been extensive.
All right, we're going to move on. That's it. That's good.
We have extensive. This is one of the issues, at least on mandatory spay neuter, that all the national organizations, the traditional organizations like HSUS, ASPCA, Best Friends, and then No Kill Advocacy Center, and pretty much all No Kill advocates, is that mandatory spay neuter sounds good when you first hear about it, but it's actually counterproductive, because what ends up happening is people's animals get rounded up and brought to the shelter, and the shelters kill more animals.
We have someone who completely agrees with you, but we can't see them on camera right now.
Well, I think I want to bring them on camera so we can get there.
That's great.
I know we're No Kill advocates when we got our animals participating.
Yeah, and agreeing with us, which I think is great. So,
so absolutely. There's been lots of research on this, and really it leads to more killing. Casey Pet Project did a case study when the mandatory spay neuter law went into effect in Kansas City for a period of time, and the shelter intake went way up and killing went up as well. On mandatory chipping, it's the same principle. Again, what happens if people don't chip their animals? Well, they'll probably get fined, and eventually they won't be able to afford the fines, and they'll turn their animals over to the shelter. And the thing about mandatory chipping that makes it even more silly is many people have their dogs licensed. So shelters, what are you going to bring in a dog that already has a license who would be returned to the owner if it went in the shelter within hours, because it doesn't also have a chip? Really silly, counterproductive, will increase killing. And many No Kill shelters have proven that you don't need mandatory chipping, mandatory spay neuter to be No Kill. You just implement the No Kill equation and you're there.
All right. Shirley, what do you think? Mandatory chipping, mandatory spay neuter?
I am not in favor of laws for either. I am in favor of spay neuter and chipping, but mandatory, no. They are barriers to pet ownership because those services are not free. So I think if you put in place laws like that, you're going to see less pet ownership, not more. And as we are seeing in some segments of society, there are going to be some people who resist anything that's labeled mandatory. So I think we should encourage spay, neuter, and chipping, make the services as low cost or, if possible, free for everyone who wants them, but mandatory, no.
I think about that. There's two things that you made me think of, Shirley, and that's number one, in most states, or at least in Colorado, you can't adopt out a pet without spay neuter. Right? It's under a certain age, or there's a clear medical reason. It's against the law to actually do so. But there's not one on chipping, and I would be okay with mandatory chipping by shelters, right? If shelters, I didn't even think of that. I would actually do that. For me, I am against the public. I agree with what both you said. I sort of think I might agree that the shelter had to chip, because they are really cheap when I put in bulk, right? They're not a big addition, but I'm going to move on. Go ahead, Aubrie. What do you think? Mandatory spay neuter, mandatory chipping?
I think, like Shirley said, it's the word mandatory that's the issue. And here in Alabama, we have a law, like you said, David, where animals adopted out from shelters and rescued have to be spayed and neutered. Now, there are some terrible loopholes in it, and hopefully we'll get those closed someday. But we're talking about owned animals. And it's really difficult when you tell someone who owns an animal, and I know we don't like to think of them as property, but they are, when we tell someone you have to do this to your pet. People don't like that. And what happens is, if let's take an example. Let's say you do have mandatory spay neuter, which people in Alabama think is just like the cure-all, and it's just not. Let's say that we had it in the city of Huntsville, which we do not. If you make it mandatory, you're going to end up with three groups of people. You're going to have group number one, which are people who breed animals or who don't want their animals spayed and neutered, and they get some type of exception to the law, so that it doesn't apply to them. That's group number one. Group number two is people that were going to spay and neuter their animals anyway, because they know that it's the right thing to do and they don't want puppies and kittens running around. Group number three is people that really can't afford to have it done. So even if you make the law mandatory, you've got one group it doesn't apply to, one group that it was going to do it anyway. Then the third group are the people that can least afford to have it done. So when you make it punitive, they either are just not going to comply with it in hopes that they don't get found out, or if somehow they are found out and they can't afford it, they're just going to surrender that animal to a shelter. So it's just going to lead to more intake. And that's the unintended consequences, David, you were talking about at the beginning. And another thing, because I deal with cities and counties all the day, because I work in the legal field during municipal defense, if we're prepared to expend time, resources, and money to enforce a punitive law, I mean, it's not cheap. I mean, we might as well expend the same time, money, and resources to just make it affordable for people. Let's say hypothetically, it would cost a city, I don't know, $100 to enforce the law for one specific pet. Are we not better to take that same $100 and just either make it free, like Shirley said, or to make it affordable? And admittedly, that is one thing that Huntsville did. And years ago, they invested in something called the Fixin' Alabama program. And what they did is they started infusing money into a program for low income residents in the city so that they can go and get their animals spayed or neutered for $5. As years have gone by, the shelter intake has dropped in half. It used to be 10,000 a year. Now it's about 5,000 a year. And now the city is investing even more money in the program because they know it's easier to pay money on the front end than it is on the back end by housing all those animals. So like we've all said, I mean, it sounds good in theory, but it just doesn't work because you're making it punitive.
All right. Well, we're out of time. So that was great. I think we're all in agreement in the beginning, and I think we're all in agreement now. So that was a pretty easy one. But thank you, everyone. There's been No Kill in Motion. Alan Rosenberg from New Jersey Animal Observer, Aubrie Kavanaugh from No Kill Huntsville, Shirley Marsh from Yes Biscuit. I'm Davyd Smith from No Kill Colorado. We will see you next week. Thanks, everybody.